Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. As always, an easy and free way to support the channel is by leaving a like, leaving a comment if you have any questions or suggestions, and by subscribing if you have not done so already. So let's jump into today's video. So in the past two videos, we've gone from setting up our environment for local web, for Lightning Web Components, as well as the local server development environment that we need to be able to test and run this code. And I think in today's video, we can kind of go ahead and start putting everything together by creating a Lightning Web Component ourselves and kind of previewing it in the local development environment, and then finally pushing it into our org, which in this case is just a test environment that I have as part of the trailhead. I will leave a playlist in the description box below in case you haven't been following along. I believe at this point it's probably going to be a three-part video series playlist, or whatever you want to call it. So feel free to click on that and watch all the previous videos, since this video will be building off of that. All right, so like you saw in the previous video, we are in our VS Code. I still have the local development server running. So if I jump into my browser, you'll see here localhost 3333, and it just says welcome to the local development server. And of course, since all we did was spin this up, we have no components deployed. So what I want to do is go back into our VS Code, and I think for our example Lightning Web Component, I'm going to create a simple calculator that we can, just deploy to our org, and then it'll be pretty simple. It'll allow you to take two inputs and then the operation itself, and it'll automatically compute the answer based off of that. And that will give us a good idea as to how Lightning Web Components work. So first thing we need to do is, I'm already, like I said, based off the previous video, I already have a project structure created. So all I need to do now is hit Control-Shift-P on the controller, which brings up the command palette, and we can either type in sfdx create Lightning Web Component, or I believe it was already part of the suggestions, so you could have just clicked on that. When we do that, it's going to ask us for a file name. I'm just going to call it simple calculator. Hit enter, and then it's going to ask us where we want to put that. I'm just going to click on or press enter, which basically just stores it in the default place where most LWC should be placed. Pretty much where that it gets stored is in Force app main default, and then down here there's a folder called LWC. You see here that after I ran the command, it kind of just created a new folder for us for our Lightning Web Component. All Lightning Web Components at the base, they have three files: an HTML, which is basically the skeleton, a JavaScript file, which is going to contain our front-end logic, and then a XML file, which describes things about our Lightning Web Component, such as what has access to it, whether it's like a record page or the home page, or basically where you want to allow this Lightning Web Component to exist. We'll get into that more towards the end. But anyways, I'm going to open up the HTML file, the JavaScript file, and then I guess also the XML file, and we can kind of run through that. So in the HTML file, we just simply have a template tag, open and closing, nothing else. In the JavaScript file, we see here that we are importing this, I forget what this is called. I think it's called a module from the Lightning Web Component library. And then just a simple statement, export means, so this is very React-based syntax, which if you're not familiar with might look a little weird, but basically we have this class called simple calculator. It's extending the Lightning element library class. I always forget the exact terminology for this. It's been a while. But essentially this is just like the base of what we get when we create this Lightning Web Component. And inside of the class, we're able to write some code. So let's jump into that. I think I'll create videos in the future that go into much more detail about, how this actually works, like what export, default, what it's actually extending is, other modules that you can import from other libraries, things like that. So yeah, like I said, I'll just keep this very high level. Kind of just want to get us started into the world of Lightning Web Components for this video. So that's the JavaScript folder. And then in the XML folder, or file, sorry, we see here we have some XML, and this just describes the API version for this Lightning Web Component. And then we have this tag called is exposed set to false. So like I said, we'll get into this more towards the end. But right now, I kind of just want to start creating this simple calculator. So first things first, let's write some HTML. And, you know, obviously the HTML that I'm going to write is just HTML that I've kind of learned and memorized over some time. I'll leave a link down below that basically references a lot of these standard input tags, in case that you're not familiar with them. So first thing I want to do is kind of create a structure. I'm going to use this thing called a lightning card, which will give us some nice styling to start with. So I'll create an opening, closing tag, or actually, yeah, opening, closing tag. I'll just press enter to create some space. And in here, I want to define some attributes. So I want to give it a title. Let's just call it simple calculator. And then I'm also going to give it an icon. So that's icon name. And then obviously I've already done this before, so I kind of know what I want it to look like. I'm going to say I want this thing called custom 14. So you'll see what that icon looks like in a minute. Inside, we're going to create a standard div tag. So that's just simple web development that you might be familiar with already. And inside of that, I want to give it a class. And like I said, all these different tags and attributes I'll provide documentation in the description box below. So feel free to refer to that. The class I want to use is a standard one that exists in the Lightning design guide. I forget the name. So it is SLDS-m-around_medium. And then inside our div class or tag, I'm going to define a lightning input like so, and close that out. And inside of that, I want to provide an attribute for label. And then our first label, that'll be the sign. So, you know, basically the operation that we want to do. And then we'll define another attribute called value. And this one doesn't need a opening and closing quotes. We're going to use a bracket. And that basically tells our code that we want to pull the value from the JavaScript file. In this case, we haven't created those values yet, or those variables, but we will in a little bit. So this one will be called sign. And then we want to add an onChange handler. So basically, if the user changes the value of this input, some JavaScript code should fire. So in this case, again, we want to use these squarely brackets to denote what piece of code we want to run. In this case, I want this function called change sign to run that will exist in our JavaScript file shortly. And then let's go ahead and copy this thing 2 more times. Oops, sorry about that. So paste once and paste twice. The second one will be for, I guess, number 1. Since, like I said, we're creating a simple calculator, it will take 2 inputs and then the operand, and then it'll output some results. So actually we need another lightning input, and this one will be called result. So the value for that, the first one can just be num1, short for number 1, and then num2, and the value here can be result. So for these, I also want some JavaScript code to run if you know the number 1 or 2 is changed. In this case, I'll just say I'll define in the JavaScript file in a little bit that the method that will run is change num1, and then we'll have a change num2. And then for our last lightning input, we're not really going to expect to change it, so let's just leave it as is. And I think that pretty much sums up our JavaScript, or sorry, our HTML file. So in the JavaScript file, we need to define the variables and functions that we've created or defined, or rather called in our HTML file. So starting with the first one, we had sign. Sign, let's just give it a starting point of plus. And then we need to close that out as well. And then we had num1. So the starting is just 0, that's fine. Num2 also, we can just say 0. And then the results, I guess we can just, so for the result, let's just start it at 0. But we could have done is say, you know, result is equal to num1 plus num2, but in this case, they're all 0. So let's just start it at 0, that's fine. And the first thing we want to do is define our first function that we called in the calculator, which was change sign. And basically, whenever that gets called from the HTML, we will have a parameter or argument passed in called event, and that basically contains the information about what that input field had. So basically, the value, what called it, what clicked it, all that other stuff. And basically, all we want to do is basically say, you know, whenever the user or something changes something in that input tag for sign. So basically, if we go back here, if something changes here, the onChange handler will fire, and it'll call this function right here, and it'll pass, like I said, it'll pass some information in the form of this event object. So all I want to do is say, okay, well, if something changed, then obviously we want to capture that change. And all we really care about in this case is grabbing what it changed to. So I know that the event object has this thing called event.target.value, which will allow us to grab the value. And now, obviously, this is just example code, so I'm not going to have, you know, crazy validation or a bunch of conditional logic that checks to make sure that the user is passing, you know, valid results. I'm just going to make the simple assumption. That way, this video doesn't become too long. So we want to, like I said, we want to grab basically what the value changed to, and then assign it to our sign variable up here. And then additionally, I think that'll be it for now. So if the input for our sign variable changes, we're basically just going to assign it to the brand new thing right here. Okay. So let's go ahead and define the other functions. That was the one called change num1. Again, whenever it gets called, it's passed in, the event object is passed in. And then we're kind of just going to do the same thing. So we're going to say we want to assign whatever change to our number1 variable. In this case, let's just grab event target dot the value. And again, we're not doing any validation or conditional logic to make sure that what we passed in was valid. Obviously, the user could very easily break this by passing in like a letter or something, or some, you know, sign that's not valid as well. But we're not going to worry about that for this case. So let me go ahead and copy and paste that for the second number. Change that real quick. And then the last thing is, we want to, in our simple calculator, basically whenever one of these three input changes, we want to be able to calculate, you know, the result, and then kind of paste it into here, the result variable. A way to do that is we can define another function, and in this case, I'll just call it recalculate. Or I guess just calculate is fine. And it's just a function that we can define. So here, I'm going to write some code, and it's going to be pretty repetitive because this is just an example. So we're going to say if the sign that the user set it to was a plus sign, then obviously we want to just, you know, sum up number1 plus number2 and paste it into the result. If I can type. So it'll be that. And then I will do some very simple conversion. So I'm going to use a number function and then set it to num1. Because if we don't use the number function, I believe by default, this right here, so basically the value we're grabbing it from, it's going to be in the form of a string. So JavaScript's kind of quirky that way, where it just does like auto typecasting for you. If you try to add two strings together, it kind of just concatenates those two strings together essentially. But I actually want, you know, mathematical operation to occur, so I'm going to convert those two numbers beforehand. So we're going to say convert this .num1 into a number, and then same thing for the second number. If I can spell or write correctly, so num2 right here. So we're basically saying what is the actual, or take the actual number value of num1 and the actual value number of num2 and add them together and then store them in the result variable if the sign that the user chose was a plus. So that covers us for addition. Let's go ahead and copy this, and we'll do one for subtraction, multiplication, and division right here. So let's go ahead and do that. Here we'll do subtraction, and then we'll use this sign right here for multiplication, and then we'll use this sign for division right here. And similarly, we can just change the sign right here for that, and for this, and as well as that. So once we have our function fully defined, let's go ahead and actually use it. So I want basically our result variable to be updated whenever the sign is changed or either the numbers are changed. To do that, all we need to do is say, by using the this keyword, and that basically just says like, we want to use the function that exists in this class, and that's defined by the this keyword. So we can just say this.calculate right here, and it's a function, so we have to call it. And let's go ahead and just copy that into our other two functions right here. As so. So I'm going to go ahead and click save, Control S to save it. And kind of to run it through one more time, basically what's going to happen is in our HTML code, we're going to have 4 inputs, and I guess this one could be an output, but I kind of just copied it, so we'll leave it as is. But basically, if the user changes the sign, the onChange handler will call this change sign function in our JavaScript code right here. And it's basically just going to assign the value of what the user inputted into the sign variable. And then it'll fire our calculate function. And in the calculate function, we're basically doing some simple conditional logic. So, if the sign is equal to plus, then it's just going to compute the addition between those two numbers. And same thing if it was negative, or sorry, subtraction, multiplication, or division. Similarly, the same thing happens if the user decides to just change the value of the number 1 or number 2. Change num1 and change num2 will get fired, respectively, and it'll basically compute or store the value of what the user chose, and then it just calls the calculate method. So to kind of see that in action, we can go ahead and go into our local development server right here. And kind of the neat thing about this, just to explain, is if I go ahead and minimize this right here, or rather, yeah, let's go ahead and I guess do it this way. Basically, anytime I make a change to the code here, so for example, if I remove this semicolon and did this and then hit save again, on the right hand side, you see that it starts to refresh. So, if you have, basically what I'm saying is you can preview your changes live as they're happening. So that's kind of cool. Anyways, let's go ahead and maximize our windows. And here we have this C-simple-calculator. This is a Lightning Web component that we've been working on this entire time. So if I click into this here, we should see a live preview of our code once it's done loading. And as you can see here, this was the title that we gave our Lightning card. It is simple calculator. Here's the first input, which is a sign. We started with a plus, and then number 1, which had 0, number 2, which has 0, and then the result, which also had 0. So now, if I go ahead and remove the 0 and I add 10 here, you can see that the result automatically gets updated with 10. And if I change this to a negative, well, it's doing 10 minus 0, so that's not doing much. But if I change this to 20, you can automatically see that it changed to negative 10, because 10 minus 20 is negative 10. And, on and on. We can do division, we can do multiplication, and it kind of looks like it just works, right? And I guess to kind of bring home the point I said about not doing much validation or conditional logic to ensure that the user can't screw things up, if I were to do something kind of quirky, like passing in a alphabetical variable here like L, it's just not going to do anything. And I'm pretty sure in the back end somehow we might get an error somewhere. But anyways, that's how we're able to use our local development server to kind of, preview the code we're writing as we're going without having to, deploy it to our sandbox or organization at all. So now, let's assume that this is perfectly, working code. And the next step would be to, to push it into our environment. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's go back to our Visual Studio Code. All right, so to get this deployed to our org, all we need to do is, and we're probably already, if you followed the previous video, you're probably already authorized an org, but if not, go ahead and kind of redo that. So click on authorize an org and then follow these instructions. I've already done it, so I don't need to do it. But if you are already authorized to an org, you should simply be able to right click on your simple calculator and you'll have these options right here. Obviously you can use the command palette to kind of run this as well if you want, but I think it's a little simpler. Just right click what you want to send, and basically all you have to do is click on this, deploy source to org. So click on that, and then on the lower right hand corner, you'll see the command is running. So it's gonna take a while, and then you'll see it's deployed to the org. Now, I think I missed was the thing that I said we would talk about, which was basically in the XML file here. So even though we deployed it, it's not really usable because we said that here by default, it's not exposed. So very quickly, what we need to do is we need to change is exposed to true, and then we need to define an extra tag, which is called targets right here. And then inside of targets, we have to define a few targets. So the first one is I want to be able to run this Lightning Web component in the app page. And I guess just for fun, also, I want to be able to run it in the record page, as well as where I'm actually going to display it for the purposes of this video in the home page. So again, don't worry if you don't really know what this means. I will create many more videos in the future that goes much more in depth into this. But for now, I want to be able to expose it to our org. And then these are the places where we could potentially use this Lightning Web component. So once we have all that, once again, right click and then deploy source to org. Give it a few seconds for it to run. And then you'll see here that it's successfully deployed to org. So now we can go into our environment, which I'm already logged into. I'm just going to simply refresh it just to make sure that we have all the code. And then what we need to do is, or rather, if you pay attention here, this is my home tab for the sales app. And as you can see here, just some simple views that we have here. I'm going to go ahead and go into our setup. And then in the setup, I'm going to search for Lightning App Builder, and then click on that. And then here, I mean, I've been messing with this Trailhead org for quite some time, but I know that the sales home is the one that we were looking at. So I'm going to go ahead and click edit on that. And then when we're in here, after it finishes loading, we see here these are all the standard components that we have. On the left-hand side, we have a lot of standard components that are provided to us by Salesforce. But if we scroll down a little bit, you'll see under custom, if we successfully deployed it, you'll see here we have our Lightning Web component called Simple Calculator. So what you could do is click and then kind of drag to wherever you want it to display it. Basically, I'm just going to put it down here underneath the key deals component. And then once we have that, you can click on activation if you never set up your own homepage. And then I've already done it. I kind of just made this the default for the entire org just for simplicity. But you might want to define, this basically allows you to define it, for which apps or by profile or just as a, org default. So go ahead and mess with that if you like. But I've set it to basically be the default for the entire org. So I should be able to see it once I click on save. After you click on save, it might take a few seconds. But then once it's done, you should be able to go to your home and then kind of just refresh it. And we should now see that we now have a new component on our homepage for the sales app. So again, we can change the sign and then make this 100, and then we'll make this the 30, and our result is 70. So yeah, I hope that's been a helpful tutorial. Hopefully my ramblings kind of made sense to you guys. Let me know if you guys have any questions down in the comment section down below. Feel free to suggest if you want to see other types of videos on any other subject pertaining to Salesforce, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Thank you for watching.